So today we commemorate 9/11. We commemorate that experience that happened 10 years ago. And I remind us all to let the dreamers wake the nation, to begin to look at and move beyond 9/11. It's interesting how moments like 9/11 become imprinted in our minds and in our hearts and in our memories. And it's one of those experiences where we always know where we were and what we were doing and who we were with and who we were talking to when we first heard about the Twin Towers coming down. It's no different than those who have lived through Pearl Harbor, who remember exactly where they were when they heard about Pearl Harbor. For those who remember exactly where you were when John F. Kennedy was shot, or when Bobby Kennedy was shot, or Martin Luther King was shot. And unfortunately, it is the tragedies that seem to bind us together and to grab our attention and to grab our hearts and to anchor us into a moment, if you will. So today we commemorate that day. And we also have a chance to look back over the past 10 years to see where we have come and where we are. Because it feels like 10 years ago, we were at a crossroads. And we had some big decisions and some big choices to make 10 years ago. And since then, we have lived in a world of tension and in war. So I want to take a moment to just review those events, and perhaps you remember where you were on that day and during that time. 10 years ago, my son was 12 and my daughter was 10, and I was taking them to school. And I would listen to Howard Stern on the radio very quietly because I didn't want the kids to hear. And Howard Stern had been playing up this thing the days previous, about this guy called the Drunken Dwarf, and the Drunken Dwarf had died. And so he was talking about having this big funeral for the Drunken Dwarf in the streets of New York. And, you know, it was kind of this thing that, you know, how he could get carried away on things. And so when I turned on the radio, I heard him saying that people in the streets of New York were crying and they were running across the bridge. And I remember thinking, I think he's taken the Drunken Dwarf thing a little too far. You know, really. I mean, it's like a joke is a joke. And then he kept going on, and then he mentioned something about how the Twin Towers were no more. And I thought, uh-oh, something happened, I think, for real. And so I switched stations to find news, and of course discovered what had actually happened on that day. 4 planes were hijacked, and 2 planes were flown into the World Trade Center, 1 into the Pentagon, and another plane went down in Pennsylvania after the passengers discovered that they were being hijacked, and so they brought the plane down rather than have it crash into the White House or wherever it was scheduled to go. I was torn at the time between taking care of my kids and being at the church, and on that day that it happened, I had talked with Gail, and she was worried because her sister worked for United Airlines and was still in the air and hadn't heard where she was. She was fine. And Seattle Center and the Space Needle were closed, and so we started having prayer services here on Wednesday and Thursday, Friday in the chapel, just small informal things. And it was there that I met Rafe for the first time, because we were having a prayer service, and I just asked for anyone to share spontaneous prayers, and this beautiful voice came from the back of the room, and I'll never forget it. It made the hair stand up on the back of my arms, as it did everyone who was there that day. Was anybody there that day? Yes. And when I tried to find him, he was gone. Nobody knew who he was. And the next day we had a prayer service, and again this beautiful voice, and this time I found him, and I said, would you mind coming on Sunday and singing and being here with us? And so it felt right that Rafe be with us 10 years later. And that was his first experience singing in a church, so are we lucky? The good. On that day, there were approximately 3,000 people killed, and the number of people who have since died from respiratory illnesses for helping out at the Trade Center has also increased that number. Since that day, 10 years ago, we have lost 4,410 American soldiers. There have been 31,844 soldiers injured. Military and veteran suicides right now outpace the rest of the population, both at home and in combat zones. And last month, or 2 months ago in July, the Army saw the most suicides. There were 32 just in the Army alone. The cost has been $4.4 trillion. On that day, when those towers came down, the towers represented for us, for our country, for the world, I think, a symbol of prosperity and a symbol of power. And the day that they fell down seems like a day that their prosperity started also to go down. These numbers are difficult to look at and they're difficult to take in, but I think it's important that we do it on this day. Following these events, we went to war based on manipulated intelligence. It was said that there was yellow cake being sold to Iraq from the Central African Republic, which proved not to be true. And although Saddam Hussein is no longer in power, I'm not sure the people of Iraq are any safer. There was an article in Time magazine, and it covered the opinions of all peoples, many peoples, about what's happened. And one young man by the name of Ali Abbas, he's an Iraqi civilian. In 2003, there was an attack on his house, and he lost both of his arms. His entire family was killed and buried in the rubble, and he has since emigrated to England. And he said, not many people liked Saddam. He said, but if you were away from him and you didn't say anything, he did not come and attack you. Now people sitting at home have bombs falling on their houses without any reason. In some ways, when the towers came down, we played into, according to Richard Clarke, we played into Osama's bin Laden's hands. Richard Clarke is a top national security official he served under Bush, and he said, we actually played into the hands of our opponents, doing precisely what they had wanted us to do, responding in the ways that they had sought to provoke, damaging our economy and alienating much of the Middle East. Bin Laden said in 2004, he said, we, along with the Mujahideen, bled Russia for 10 years until it went bankrupt and was forced to withdraw in defeat. We are continuing this policy in bleeding America to the point of bankruptcy, and all that we have to do is to send 2 Mujahideen to the furthest point east to raise a piece of cloth on which is written Al-Qaeda in order to make generals race there and to cause America to suffer human, economic, and political losses. The civilians in Iraq that have been killed number around 62,000, and there have been approximately 1 million violent deaths related to the war. In Afghanistan, the civilian deaths are between 10,000 and 49,000. Again, I know these numbers are difficult to take in, but sometimes I think we lose sight and focus on the 3,000 that we lost and recognize that that number is so much higher in our troops and in civilians. And I think as we move forward from this day, it's important that we take a mirror and hold it up to ourselves and to look at the facts and to look at the reality of what is happening and what has happened. Because it feels like 10 years ago we had a choice. You know, we were at a choice point. We had the world behind us to move forward. I watched a documentary yesterday that is actually going to be on tonight, and it was filmed by these two French brothers, the Naudet brothers. And I actually had made a video of it when it was first shown. It was 6 months after 9/11. And the story was that these two French young documentarians were there to film a rookie fireman over a 9-month period. And what they wanted to do was to record how a young man or a boy turns into a man in the course of 9 months, how he turns into a man through the course of being trained to be a firefighter. The firemen say that there are two kinds of rookies. One is a white cloud, and the other is called a black cloud. He said when you have a black cloud come into the firehouse, then that person seems to draw every fire in the city. When you have a white cloud in the firehouse, there's no fires and nothing going on. And so what happened as these filmmakers were videoing this firehouse, and Tony, the rookie, he was a white cloud and there were no fires at all in the summer. And they said, the veterans would say, you need to be careful, because they would say, well, when is there going to be a fire? Because you need to be careful what you ask for, because when it's quiet like this, something big usually follows. And so by September 10th, the two documentarians said they had a lot of great footage of life in the firehouse, and it would make a great cooking show, but not much else. In fact, on September 10th, the French young men said they would like to cook dinner for the firemen, and so they decided to make some fancy thing with roast leg of lamb and all this stuff. And what they didn't realize is that there's like 15 guys, and they're big, and they only brought one leg of lamb. And so it's quite comical to watch them cut through these little tiny pieces of meat, and of course the firemen just harassing the French and saying, okay, so pretty soon we'll be able to wear your shirts, and two of us can fit into one shirt. The next morning, they were called, a few of the firemen were called to inspect a gas leak, and the filmmaker asked if he could come along, because he went along everywhere, and so they said sure, because at this point the only fire Tony got to put out was a car fire, a little car fire. And so you probably have seen that famous footage by now where the firemen are looking in the grate in the sidewalk, and they've got their little counters, and they're checking to see if there is any gas leak there. And as they're doing this, and they're being filmed, all of a sudden you can hear this plane coming over their head, and the cameraman looks up at the same exact time, and the first plane goes right into the building. Now, they're at Station 1. They're the closest firehouse to the World Trade Center. They're the first people there. They set up a command post, except for Tony, who's got to stay back and man the firehouse. And the filmmaker goes along, and so the footage is of what happened inside the World Trade Center as the second one fell, as World Trade Center 2 fell, and as the horror unfolded. Miraculously, nobody in Station 1 lost their lives. Not one single fireman, when you consider the losses of the rescue workers on that day. And at the end of the day, or the next day, the documentarians were asking the firemen to reflect on the day, and particularly Tony, the rookie. And Tony said, you know, I joined the fire department because I wanted to save lives. And if it wasn't the fire department, it probably would have been the Army, but I kind of like to save lives rather than kill. And then he thought for a moment, and he said, but if my country asked me, if my country sent me, I will go, and I will kill if that's what I have to do. But I would rather save lives. And this is the way it goes, isn't it? It always seems to go this way. we're hurt, we want to hurt back. We do it not only on a national, global level, but we do it on a personal level. We want to get revenge, we want to get back, we want to attack. And it seems to be the way we are, and that it's gone on and on for thousands of years. And I wonder, when will we ever get the message? When will we ever wake up? My son, who loves films, would come home all the time with all these different movies from all these different countries and different ages. And we watched the movie All's Quiet on the Western Front, which I believe was made in the late 30s, but I'm not sure. And the story is about World War I and how these young guys are like, can't wait to get there, boy. And then they get there and they realize what it is. And so they come home and they try to tell people what it is, but nobody wants to hear because they're all caught up in this thing. And it ends with this main character just saying, okay, and he goes back to the front. And at the end of the film, maybe it's at the beginning of the film, in the credits, there's this long piece that says, the reason this film was made is so that we never have to go through anything like this again. And of course, we go through it again, and we go through it again, and we go through it again. Ben Ferenc said, he is a lawyer who tried some of the Nazi officers in Nuremberg. He said, how do you avoid war? No one's ever avoided war before. He said, no one has ever invented anything which was invented for the first time. So we never landed on the moon before. We never flew with airplanes before. We never had the internet before. And yet we have all these things. It's miraculous. What's so difficult about organizing our affairs so you don't have to go out and kill somebody because he's different? People are entitled to their religion and their nationalism, but they're not entitled to kill their neighbors because they're different. He is now in his 90s, and he calls for world law, where we're held accountable, where people are held accountable for their actions and decisions. So, how do we move beyond 9/11? How do we learn the lessons from the last 10 years? We've been studying and pursuing our dreams this year. We've been following the theme of let the dreamers wake the nation. So what is the dream that you have for this nation? What is the dream that you have for this world? I think the division of religions needs to come to an end. You know, where one is the right path and one is the wrong. And it's one of the reasons that we have all of the altars around the sanctuary, is to call in our ancestors, is to call in the wisdom of all these different teachers and teachings. Each tapestry that we have that has been headed up by Annie Christensen and many tapestry members, each one takes about a year to make. And they're not just sort of haphazardly created. A whole year is spent studying the religion that each one represents, so that the symbols come through them. The symbols collectively come through them. And then they are here to bless us, to remind us that all religions are true. Currently, we're working on the African tapestry. That's the one that's currently being made. Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your strength, and with all your mind and soul, and to love your neighbor as yourself. We are being called to do that. And we are being called to release prejudices, personally, nationally, globally, whether it be racially or sexual orientation or whatever it is. We need to just give it up already. And start moving forward. What happens is when we spend our money, when we spend our resources, when we spend our lives pursuing destruction, we are distracted from what is really going on and what is really important. And what is really important right now is taking care of our planet, is taking care of our children, is taking care of the people in Africa who are experiencing famine, the climate change. We have so many big things that are calling for our attention and our love, and we're brilliant. We are brilliant. We can create solutions, and we need to stop being distracted by the thing that we've been distracted by for thousands of years. Teilhard de Chardin talked about a thought envelope that sort of encompassed the earth, the noosphere. And the idea behind it is that we are evolving into awakened beings, that the planet is awakening, and that the planet knows itself through us. And so we are focusing on that today. Would you drop the screen? So in Unity, we have and recognize that everything begins with our thoughts, everything begins with our prayers, everything begins with turning within. We recognize that when we sow a thought, we reap an act, and we sow an act, and we reap a habit, and we sow a habit, and we reap a character until we have our destiny. And so today, at 3:46 p.m., there is a call for all of us to stop for a moment and to send loving kindness and compassion into the world. The idea behind it is from HeartMath and from the Global Consciousness Project, from Lynn McTaggart, who are saying, let's focus our energies together. And so we happen to live in an amazing city. It's happening at Seattle Center. Rafe is singing there this afternoon. And it's been going on all weekend. So I want to show you this for a moment.
These frequencies will never match up. If your dial is set to 102.6 FM, you can't receive what's on 650 AM. Our collective thoughts and feelings are even more powerful. After 10 years of fear and anger, we've seen the results. So what is a frequency that offers solutions to our universal needs? Love. It's been the force that has guided the most powerful and long-lasting influencers, and the essence of who we all truly are. Imagine if on the day that we remember one of history's most upsetting events, we stop the cycle of fear. And instead, imagine honoring those who sacrificed so much by focusing on our love for each other. Come and join us live or online for a free 3-day global event designed to share solutions and accelerate our shift from fear to love and from surviving to thriving. Participate with inspirational leaders, musicians, and one another as we acknowledge our fears and share our brilliance, our abundance, our resourcefulness, and our magnificence. And then, 10 years and 10 hours after a global moment of fear and anger, we invite you to be part of the solution by coming together in a spectacular act of love and kindness as we open our hearts and send love at the exact same moment. 10 years or 10 hours after the event, at 10:46 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, imagine this moment. Today, the balance. Join us in celebration.
So how many of you already know about this? And how many of you have attended some of the events over the weekend? So whether you go to Seattle Center at 3:46 p.m. this afternoon, or whether you're at home with your loved ones, or whether you're at home by yourself, I invite us all to stop and to take a moment to send love to this noosphere, to this thought envelope. We're a spiritual community, and I know that when we put out the surveys, what we found was that 90%, I believe, of this community has a spiritual practice that we engage in at least 5 times a week, if not 7. So I invite you to use that spiritual practice that you engage in already and to join at this moment with everyone to bless the planet. Again, part of what has brought it together is HeartMath, which is focusing on love and focusing on the heart, which can help change things. Another organization studies events in life to see if there's a change through New Year's Eve or through tragedies or through blessing. And we're trying that with South Lake Union, watching and hoping the crime rate drops as we bless it and as we pray. David Nicole of the Center for Subtle Activism. Do you hear that? Subtle activism? There's all kinds of activism, and it begins with subtle activism, which is going within, and then we move without. He said the use of spiritual or consciousness-based practices, such as prayer, meditation, or ritual to support collective healing and social change is what we're about and what is happening today. So as we commemorate this day of 9/11, as we remember where we were, as we take time to be quiet and are silent, I think it's also important that we stop for a moment and hold a mirror up to ourselves and ask ourselves, where are we? What's happening? And where are we going? To review those events. It was on that day that that symbol fell, that we sort of fell into this dream that we're in. And so we wake up from it. And we call for all the dreamers to wake the nation. Thank you.